Usually when we talk about a war, there's this expectation of visibility.
Right, absolutely. We want to see it.
Exactly. We expect to see troops mobilizing or borders shifting on a map, like satellite imagery showing the destruction in high definition. We look for visceral, tangible destruction.
Which is, I mean, that's exactly how our brains are wired to understand conflict. We look for the kinetic energy, the physical clash that you can point to and comprehend immediately.
But the moment you step into the world of global finance and geopolitics, that visibility completely vanishes.
Oh, it's totally gone.
Yeah. So what if I told you there is an invisible war happening right now, at this exact second? Not for physical territory, but for the fundamental plumbing of the global economy.
That's the scary part. It's happening entirely out of plain sight.
Right. A conflict where the weapons aren't necessarily missiles or aircraft carriers, but interest rates, bond yields, and physical gold bullion.
And the battlefield in this scenario is essentially your wallet. I mean, it's your savings account, your purchasing power, and the entire architecture of the global financial system.
It's massive.
We're talking about the absolute definition of a structural paradigm shift happening entirely behind the scenes.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a truly urgent, high-stakes analysis that frames the precipice we are standing on.
And we are definitely on a precipice.
We really are. The date is April 2026, and we are unpacking an incredibly sobering breakdown by analyst Andre Geek titled The End of Pax Americana.
It's a fascinating piece of work.
It really is. Our mission for this deep dive is to untangle a massive, complex web of information. We're going to unpack the potential collapse of the petrodollar system, decode the strategic geopolitical chess match happening in the Middle East, and most importantly, translate these blaring, almost deafening alarms coming from the bond market into understandable realities for you, the listener.
Because while it's completely natural to get caught up in the day-to-day, like, worrying about your morning commute, your upcoming performance review, picking up groceries, there are massive tectonic plates of macroeconomics shifting beneath our feet.
Yeah, this isn't just academic theory.
No, not at all. It's not some abstract white paper. It is unfolding right now, actively altering the fundamental pricing of every single thing we consume.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the backdrop against which all of this geopolitical tension is happening is basically a macroeconomic powder keg.
That is the perfect way to describe it, a powder keg.
The world of 2026 is incredibly fragile economically. We have to start by looking at the interest rate environment. We've been living in this high-rate regime for much longer than anyone originally modeled or anticipated when inflation first spiked a few years ago.
Right, and the high rates themselves aren't just an abstract penalty set by a central bank. They function as a brutal stress test on the entire economic machine.
A stress test that a lot of things are failing.
Exactly. When the cost of borrowing money stays elevated for a prolonged period, the foundational structures of the economy start to fracture. You have to remember, the entire global financial system was built, expanded, and dangerously over-leveraged during a multi-decade era of essentially free money.
Right. Zero interest rates.
We had 0% interest rates for so long that business models were designed around the assumption that capital would always be cheap. Now that the cost of capital is incredibly high, that leverage is turning toxic.
That's like a house of cards.
It is. And this geopolitical crisis we are about to discuss is hitting at the absolute worst possible moment in the economic cycle.
Let's put a magnifying glass on one of the biggest structural cracks we are seeing right now, which is in what analysts call the shadow banking system. We are talking about a $9.4 trillion industry.
That number is just staggering, $9.4 trillion.
It really is. And these are the massive private credit giants companies like Blackstone, Apollo, Blue Owl.
Right, these aren't your traditional corner banks where you go to open a checking account and get a free toaster.
Yeah. No, definitely not. These are massive, sophisticated institutions that stepped in to lend heavily to businesses when traditional banks pulled back.
And they lent to everyone. Middle market companies, real estate developers.
Yeah, and they were heavily funded by pension funds, meaning, by extension, everyday retirement accounts are exposed. And currently, this entire sector is facing a severe liquidity crisis.
And liquidity is the operative concept to understand here.
Yeah.
In the private credit world, money is locked up in massive, complex, bespoke loans to private businesses.
So you can't just sell it off quickly.
Exactly. These aren't like stocks you can sell on an exchange in milliseconds. They are highly illiquid. Now, because of the stress in the broader economy, higher costs, slower consumer spending, The investors who originally funded these private credit giants are getting nervous.
They want their cash back.
They want their capital back. They are demanding redemptions. But the system simply cannot return the cash quickly. Those underlying loans cannot be easily sold off to raise cash without taking a massive loss.
So it's a huge bottleneck.
It is. We are seeing the share prices of these massive financial institutions taking a beating because they are caught in a brutal squeeze. On one side, investors are demanding cash exits, and on the other side, the borrowers are struggling just to make their interest payments at these new exorbitant rates.
Wow. And while that financial plumbing is getting backed up in the corporate world, the actual real-world economy, the reality you're experiencing right now, is feeling a totally different kind of squeeze.
Yeah, the job market is a perfect example of that.
Let's talk about the job market. We've got Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, coming out with this incredibly alarming statement recently. He said there has been effectively zero net job creation in the private sector for the last year. Zero.
I mean, that zero net job creation number is staggering when you map it against population growth.
Right, because we need jobs for new people.
An economy has to create thousands of jobs every month just to keep pace with new graduates entering the workforce. But the context behind the zero growth makes it even more chilling.
And this is where AI comes in, right?
Exactly. Major corporations are explicitly citing artificial intelligence as the primary justification for mass layoffs and sweeping hiring freezes.
So this isn't just a temporary dip.
No, we are not looking at a standard cyclical downturn where a company tightens its belt, waits out a recession for a few quarters, and then hires everyone back. This is a permanent structural replacement of human labor designed to maintain corporate profit margins in a highly unforgiving economic environment.
I want to tie this directly back to you, the listener, for a moment. Visualize your own financial ecosystem. Think about your 401k or your pension.
Which is likely holding exposure to these strained private credit markets without you even realizing it.
Right. And think about your weekly grocery bill, which is hypersensitive to the inflation and energy prices we are about to discuss. And think about your job security, sitting squarely in the crosshairs of this AI revolution, combined with a zero-growth environment.
It's all connected.
All of these core pillars of your life are sitting directly in the blast radius of this incredibly fragile macroeconomic setup. And an economically fragile world is the absolute perfect time for rival nations to initiate a geopolitical strike.
Because if your adversary is already internally stressed, dealing with sticky inflation, a sovereign debt crisis, and a highly vulnerable stagnant job market, you don't need to defeat them on a traditional battlefield.
You just hit them where it hurts financially.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You just need to apply targeted pressure to their existing economic stress points until the internal system buckles under its own weight.
Which transitions us perfectly into the first major piece of this puzzle, the geopolitical chessboard. We are watching a high-stakes, multi-dimensional match over the one commodity that truly dictates the pace of the modern world: energy.
Oil and gas, the lifeblood of everything.
The analysis outlines 5 distinct factions at the table, each operating with incredibly specific, often conflicting motivations. Let's examine the incumbent power first, the United States.
So the United States' primary objective is preservation of the status quo. They are defending Pax Americana.
Which basically just means American peace, right?
Right. Historically, Pax Americana refers to the relative global peace and stability overseen by U.S. military and economic hegemony since the end of World War II. But if you strip away the military aspect, the financial core of this global power is the petrodollar system.
This is huge. Let's break down the petrodollar.
The U.S. imperative is to ensure that global oil continues to be exclusively priced and traded in U.S. dollars. The mechanics of this are crucial. Because the world runs on oil, and oil is priced in dollars, every nation on Earth is forced to acquire and hold U.S. dollars to buy the energy they need to survive.
So everyone is forced to use our currency.
Exactly. And once those nations have those surplus dollars, they need a safe place to store them. So they reinvest those dollars into U.S. Treasury bonds. This essentially funds the U.S. government's massive deficit spending and keeps American borrowing costs artificially low.
It is a brilliantly constructed, self-sustaining loop. The world needs energy, therefore the world needs dollars, therefore the world buys U.S. debt, allowing the U.S. to spend way beyond its means.
It's an exorbitant privilege.
Yeah. Then you look across the board at China, and their goal is the exact inverse. They are actively seeking to dismantle that self-sustaining loop.
Right. China is the manufacturing engine of the world. To run that engine, they need immense amounts of cheap energy.
And they don't want to rely on dollars for it.
They want to secure that energy, and they want to graduate to becoming the ultimate price setter for global commodities. The overarching strategy, however, is to achieve this massive transition of global power without firing a single shot.
So it's an economic war, not a kinetic one.
Exactly. They are engineering an economic victory, avoiding a direct military confrontation that could disrupt their trade routes.
Moving to another massive player, we have Russia. According to the Deep Dive's analysis, Russia might actually emerge as the biggest structural beneficiary of the current chaos.
Which sounds crazy, given they are actively in a conflict, but mathematically it makes sense.
Right. They are endowed with vast domestic reserves of both energy and raw commodities. But their current strategic aggression stems from a very specific catalyst, which is the events of 2022.
Right, the sanctions.
Yeah. When the West reacted to the invasion of Ukraine by freezing massive amounts of Russia's US dollar reserves and removing them from the SWIFT payment system, it sent a shockwave through the non-Western world.
It was a massive wake-up call for everyone else.
Exactly. Since that moment, Russia has been aggressively seeking out and building robust alliances with any nation willing to trade outside of the U.S. financial jurisdiction.
They are providing the raw materials and actively helping other nations build the financial infrastructure to bypass the dollar entirely. This ensures their own economic survival while expanding a parallel economic bloc.
Setting the stage perfectly for Iran, Iran is in a fascinating, highly volatile position because their baseline goal is simply survival and regional influence.
Right, they have a very specific set of demands.
They want binding security guarantees, they want the U.S. military footprint removed from their immediate region, and they want the lifting of decades of crippling economic sanctions. But the method they use to fight for these goals is truly mind-bending. It is the textbook definition of asymmetric warfare.
Right, because how does a heavily sanctioned nation with a fraction of the military budget of a Western superpower project enough force to demand a seat at the table?
The analogy I keep coming back to, and this really illustrates it perfectly, it's like fighting a state-of-the-art tank with a swarm of cheap mechanical beasts.
I love that analogy. It's so accurate.
You have the U.S. and its regional allies deploying these incredibly sophisticated, multi-million-dollar missile defense systems. An interceptor missile can cost $2, $3, sometimes $4 million a pop.
Just for one missile.
Just one. And Iran counters this by utilizing massive coordinated swarms of relatively cheap drones that cost maybe $10,000 or $20,000 to manufacture.
Economically, this is a brilliant war of attrition.
Right. You force your adversary to spend millions of dollars just to swat down a few $1,000s worth of hardware. You are bleeding their defense budget dry without ever engaging in a fair fight.
That concept of economic attrition is the beating heart of their entire geopolitical strategy. The deep dive refers to it as the strategy of pain.
Strategy of pain. That sounds grim.
It is. Iran understands it cannot win a conventional force-on-force military victory against the West. But they don't need to. They simply need to disrupt the arteries of the global economy, specifically global shipping lanes and energy markets, long enough to make the world's wallet scream.
Make the citizens feel it.
Exactly. The underlying calculation is that if global gas prices spike to unprecedented levels, if consumer inflation roars back to life, and if delicate supply chains shatter, the citizens of Western nations will feel so much intense personal economic pain that they will force their own governments to agree to a ceasefire.
Just to make the pain stop.
Right. They'll grant Iran the concessions it desires just to get back to normal.
And the sheer chaos generated by this strategy is also incredibly profitable if you are on the inside and know how to play the volatility. The source material highlights a staggering reality about how modern financial markets react to geopolitical theater.
Oh, the volatility trading is insane.
We are seeing markets swing violently based on conflicting political statements. One day, a prominent political figure announces that massive peace negotiations are underway. The algorithms that control the stock market instantly read that headline, and the markets surge in relief.
But then the very next day, that statement is retracted. Or Iran completely denies that any back-channel negotiations were ever taking place.
It creates a complete whiplash of information.
And the monetization of that volatility is where the true cynicism of the system reveals itself. The analysis points out a chilling example.
Yes, the $60 million trade.
Right. A single, unidentified entity placed a $1.5 billion futures contract just minutes before a major market-moving peace announcement was made public.
Just minutes before.
When the news hit the wires, the market surged violently upward, and that single, perfectly timed trade netted over $60 million in pure profit in less than 20 minutes.
That blows my mind. 60 million in 20 minutes.
It serves as a stark reminder that while geopolitical uncertainty and the threat of war are terrifying for the average citizen trying to protect their savings, chaos is a massive, highly efficient wealth generation engine for insiders who have access to information before it reaches the public.
It is a sobering look behind the curtain. And caught in the middle of all these massive players, you have the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC.
The Gulf states are in a really tricky spot.
We're talking about sovereign states like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar. They are occupying the most delicate position on the board right now. Their primary desire is domestic stability and the continuation of their immense wealth generation.
So they're playing both sides.
Exactly. They are playing both sides of the fence. They are hedging their bets, maintaining their historical security ties to the old, comfortable petrodollar system, while simultaneously entertaining the new, emerging alternative economic architecture that China and Russia are actively constructing.
Watching the hedging behavior of those Gulf states is perhaps the single most critical leading indicator for the future of global finance.
Because they have the oil.
They control the actual physical commodity that the world needs. Whoever they choose to sell to, and more importantly, the currency they choose to accept in return, will dictate the balance of power for the next century.
Let's dig into the mechanics of how this pressure is actually applied. How does Iran execute this strategy of pain in a way that actually threatens the global economy? They accomplish this by exerting influence over the ultimate choke point of world energy.
The Strait of Hormuz.
Yes, the Strait of Hormuz.
To understand the gravity of the Strait of Hormuz, you really have to look at a map. It is essentially the jugular vein of the global industrial complex.
It's tiny, right? Geographically speaking.
It's incredibly narrow. And yet, roughly 20% of all the world's daily oil consumption and a massive portion of its liquefied natural gas flows through this easily contested waterway.
20%. That is massive.
The deep dive argues that the single most critical metric to watch right now isn't the S&P 500, and it isn't even the spot price of a barrel of crude oil.
Okay, so what is it?
The vital metric is a maritime chart tracking total transit tanker calls.
Total transit tanker calls.
Right. This is raw data tracking how many massive cargo ships are actually successfully navigating through the strait each day. Every single day, that transit number drops. Every day, the strait is effectively restricted by drone threats or naval harassment. The global economy's desperation compounds.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because the harassment in the strait isn't just about causing blind, anarchic chaos. It is a highly calculated, coordinated move designed to force the world onto an entirely new financial track.
Which brings us to the core focus of the analysis, the gold oil conversion theory.
Yes, let's get into this, because this is where the puzzle pieces snap together. Iran, Russia, and China have effectively formed an alliance of convenience to build a direct, functioning alternative to the petrodollar system.
And they each hold a vital, irreplaceable piece of the puzzle.
Right. Iran provides the geopolitical leverage through its ability to threaten the choke point. Russia provides the massive alternative supply of oil for nations desperate for energy. And China provides the alternative payment rails to facilitate the transaction outside of Western oversight.
It functions as a masterclass in macroeconomic judo. They are using the West's reliance on open shipping lanes against it.
How so?
Well, Iran's implicit offer to the non-Western world operates like a toll booth. The message is essentially, the strait is no longer freely open to the old financial system. However, if your nation agrees to purchase its energy using Chinese yuan instead of US dollars, we will guarantee your oil tankers safe, unharassed passage through the Strait of Hormuz.
Okay, wait. Let me stop you there and push back on the mechanics of this, because there is a massive friction point here. The US dollar is ubiquitous. It is highly liquid. Any nation can trade dollars instantly anywhere in the world. The Chinese yuan, on the other hand, is not a freely floated currency.
Not at all. It's tightly controlled.
It is tightly controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. They manage the exchange rate, and they utilize strict capital controls to prevent money from easily leaving their country. If I am a massive sovereign nation trying to buy millions of barrels of oil, I can't just log on to a global exchange and easily acquire billions of yuan.
The liquidity just isn't there.
Exactly. So how does this workaround actually function in the real world? Why would a country subject itself to that friction?
That friction point you just highlighted is exactly the genius and the systemic danger of the new system. Because the yuan is tightly controlled and subject to capital controls, a foreign nation cannot simply purchase it in massive quantities using their existing US dollars. To acquire yuan, you have to sell China a tangible asset that the Chinese government actually desires. And historically, the ultimate universally recognized asset that China has always been willing to accept in infinite quantities in exchange for their currency is physical gold.
Let's walk through the exact transaction flow for the listener, because understanding this mechanism is crucial to understanding how the petrodollar could actually break.
It's a fascinating four-step process.
Okay, imagine you are an energy-starved nation, let's say in Asia or Africa, and you need oil to keep your factories running, but you want to avoid the chaos in the strait. Step one. You take your treasury of US dollars and you enter the global market to purchase physical gold bullion.
Right, you get the gold.
Step two. You take that newly acquired physical gold and you sell it directly to China. China takes the gold into its reserves and credits your account with Chinese yuan.
Which you now hold in an offshore account.
Yep. Step three. You take that newly acquired yuan, you approach Iran or Russia, and you purchase the oil you desperately need. And step four. Because you utilize the approved alternative financial system, your oil tankers are granted a guaranteed safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz.
If we connect this transaction flow to the bigger picture, the implications are staggering. First, the US dollar was completely excised from the most important commodity transaction in the world.
Totally cut out of the loop.
But more importantly, look at the role China just assumed. Because they control the issuance of the yuan and they are the entity accepting the gold, China effectively inserts itself as the ultimate arbiter of global value.
They become the bank.
They get to dictate the exchange rate between the physical gold they're receiving and the oil that other nation is ultimately buying. They are systematically stripping the US dollar of its historical exorbitant privilege to set the baseline price of global commodities.
This sounds like a plot from a geopolitical thriller, but the deep dive presents hard, quantifiable data proving that this architectural shift is happening right now. The catalyst traces back to that moment in 2022 when the U.S. and its allies froze Russia's sovereign dollar reserves.
We keep coming back to that, but it really was the turning point.
That action served as a massive flashing warning light for the rest of the world. Since that moment, international trade data shows that Swiss gold exports heading directly to Saudi Arabia and the broader GCC region have absolutely skyrocketed.
And Switzerland is the crucial geographical detail in that data point.
Wait, why are these transactions flowing through the Swiss?
Because Switzerland historically acts as a neutral, highly secure financial hub with deep expertise in precious metals refining and storage. The analysis indicates that the Gulf states are heavily utilizing offshore yuan-clearing bank accounts located within Switzerland.
So they're using Swiss accounts to hide the trade.
Basically, yeah. This sophisticated infrastructure allows them to seamlessly swap physical gold for Chinese yuan without those transactions ever touching an American correspondent bank.
Which means they remain completely outside the jurisdiction of U.S. financial sanctions.
Exactly. When the leadership in Saudi Arabia witnessed the West freeze Russia's dollar assets overnight, they realized that holding the bulk of their sovereign wealth in U.S. Treasury bonds represented a massive, unacceptable geopolitical risk.
So they started diversifying.
Immediately, trading portions of their oil directly for Chinese manufactured goods and settling the remaining trade imbalances in physical gold.
It represents a catastrophic collapse in trust regarding the weaponization of the dollar. And perhaps the most surreal aspect of this entire shift is that the United States itself is quietly participating in this new gold-centric reality.
This part is truly unbelievable.
Trade data analyzed in the sources shows that for several recent months, the single biggest export leaving the United States by dollar value wasn't high-end software, it wasn't commercial aircraft, it wasn't agricultural products.
It was gold.
It was gold, specifically categorized as non-monetary gold, which means physical bullion, actual bars and coins, not paper contracts. The United States is literally settling portions of its own massive international trade deficit by shipping record amounts of physical gold out of its domestic vaults to foreign nations.
Which confirms that the alternative toll booth structure is functioning and gaining immense traction. The global economy requires oil to function. The The toll for safe passage is increasingly being demanded in yuan, and the yuan must be acquired by surrendering physical gold.
However, this raises an incredibly important, terrifying mathematical reality regarding the physical scale of these two distinct markets.
The math simply doesn't add up.
The mathematical crisis of this gold-oil conversion, the sheer scale here is completely mismatched, almost comically so. The global oil market is an absolute behemoth. It produces and consumes roughly $4.1 trillion worth of value every single year.
4.1 trillion. Keep that number in mind.
Contrast that with the entire global gold mining industry. Every mine on Earth combined only produces about $485 billion worth of newly refined gold annually. The physical oil market is nearly 9 times larger than the physical gold market.
Right. So think about the physics of financial plumbing. If you attempt to take a massive $4.1 trillion commodity and force it to be settled and transacted through a highly constrained $485 billion monetary layer, the mechanical physics of that market simply break down.
The analogy I use to visualize this, it's like trying to forcefully pump an entire Olympic-sized swimming pool's worth of water into a standard residential bathtub.
The bathtub is going to overflow instantly.
The bathtub simply cannot contain that volume. The water violently displaces over the edges. Translated into financial terms, if even a modest fraction of the multi-trillion-dollar global oil trade is suddenly forced to utilize physical gold as its primary conversion and settlement layer, the sheer demand shock hitting the gold market would be unprecedented in modern financial history.
The price of gold would have to explode.
Right. The only way the underlying mathematics function is if the price of an ounce of gold is forced to unimaginable astronomical heights, simply to absorb the sheer, overwhelming volume of the oil wealth attempting to flow through it.
And that underlying mathematical certainty is exactly why highly sophisticated analysts, central banks, and sovereign nations are aggressively hoarding physical gold assets behind the scenes.
They see the math.
They're looking at the same math we are, and they realize the current pricing of gold is severely disconnected from its rapidly emerging role as the critical, unavoidable settlement layer for the world's most vital energy commodity.
While this incredibly high-stakes, multi-trillion-dollar geopolitical game is being played across the oceans with gold, oil, and drone swarms, the actual scoreboard where the United States is undeniably losing the game is domestic. It's the bond market.
This is where it hits home.
And this is where the abstract geopolitical theory violently collides with the domestic U.S. economy.
What's fascinating here is how deeply misunderstood the bond market is by the general public, and even by many casual investors.
Everyone just watches the stock market.
Exactly. Everyone fixates on the Dow Jones or the S&P 500. But the bond market is the true underlying engine of the global economy because it fundamentally dictates the cost of borrowing money for everyone, governments, corporations, and individuals.
And right now, the underlying ledger of the U.S. government is in a state of severe deterioration. The deep dive zeroes in on data from February 2026 to examine a critical metric called true interest expense.
We need to decode that term clearly.
Yeah, let's explain it. True interest expense is a much broader, more terrifying metric than just the interest payments on the national debt. It combines the mandatory non-discretionary spending of the federal government, the massive unbreakable promises like Social Security, Medicare, and core health spending, and adds those to the actual cash interest payments required to service the massive federal debt.
Right, the stuff you absolutely have to pay no matter what.
In February 2026, the data revealed that these basic absolute baseline obligations exceeded the total tax revenue the government brought in by roughly 30%.
Consider the scale of that deficit. Before the federal government allocates a single dollar to repair a bridge, before it funds public education, before it pays the salaries of federal employees, before it does literally anything discretionary, it is already operating 30% in the red, just attempting to pay for its absolute baseline survival obligations.
That is just terrifying.
And here is the truly alarming context. That 30% deficit figure was calculated before the unpredictable costs of this escalating global supply chain war factored in, and before massive new defense budgets were requested by the Pentagon to deal with these simultaneous global crises.
So it's actually much worse now.
The United States Treasury is bleeding capital at a rate never before seen outside of a declared world war.
Which leads directly to what we can call the bond market rebellion. If you rewind to the beginning of 2026, every major financial institution on Wall Street, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, they were all aggressively pushing the exact same narrative.
Oh, the soft landing narrative.
Yes. The consensus was that inflation was officially beaten, the Federal Reserve was going to steadily cut interest rates, borrowing for homes and cars would get significantly cheaper, and the U.S. economy would glide into this beautiful, painless, soft landing.
But the bond market completely rejected that narrative.
Instead of yields falling, the 10-year Treasury yield, which acts as the foundational benchmark for global borrowing costs, started violently skyrocketing.
We must delve into the mechanics of why that yield is skyrocketing, despite the predictions of Wall Street. It comes down to a financial concept known as the term premium.
Term premium, what is that exactly?
This is the extra financial compensation, the additional yield, that an investor absolutely demands in exchange for taking on the specific risk of locking their money up for a long period of time in an uncertain environment.
The analogy I use to explain term premiums relies on understanding risk and collateral. Imagine you have a reliable friend who asks to borrow $20 to grab lunch. You know they are employed and they get a paycheck on Friday, so you hand them the 20. You don't charge them interest.
Right, the transaction is essentially risk-free.
But imagine that same friend comes to you, and their life is in shambles. Their house is currently on fire. They just got fired from their job. They've maxed out 5 credit cards, and now they want to borrow a significant amount of money, and they promise to pay you back in 10 years.
You are definitely not giving them that money easily.
You aren't just going to hand them the money at a low interest rate. You are going to demand a massive interest rate to compensate for the high probability they might never pay you back. And you are probably going to demand some serious physical collateral.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates how global bond investors are currently viewing the United States Treasury. The international bond market is looking at Washington, D.C. and assessing the risk profile.
And they don't like what they see.
Not at all.
Yeah.
They're saying, you are spending vastly more money than you collect in taxes. You are entangled in multiple geopolitical conflicts that are actively threatening to shatter global supply chains, which inherently threatens to reignite massive inflation. And you want us to confidently lock our sovereign wealth up in your paper bonds for the next 10 years. Absolutely not.
So they demand higher interest.
If you want our capital to fund your deficits, you are going to have to compensate us with a significantly higher yield. Consequently, during Treasury auctions, the demand is weak, which forces the yield higher to attract buyers.
It is a crisis of confidence. And it isn't isolated to a domestic American problem. The analysis points to a massive European contagion factor accelerating this crisis.
The global interconnectedness is key here.
The deep dive draws a direct historical parallel to the Liz Truss moment in the United Kingdom back in October 2022. For those who might not recall the specifics, the UK government announced a massive unfunded tax cut budget. The UK bond market, the gilt market, reacted so violently to the prospect of that much unbacked debt that the entire UK pension system, which utilized complex liability-driven investment strategies, almost collapsed overnight.
It was terrifying. The Bank of England had to step in with the emergency, unprecedented market interventions just to stop a total financial meltdown.
Right now in 2026, we are watching UK 2-year yields violently spiking again in a very similar pattern.
If we pull that thread and connect the European instability to the American bond market, the contagion mechanism becomes clear.
Wait, why does a crisis in the UK or European bond market immediately translate into a crisis for the United States Treasury?
Because UK and European institutional investors collectively own roughly 40% of all foreign-held U.S. Treasury bonds.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it was that high.
It's a huge chunk. Now, place those European investors in the current geopolitical context we just discussed. The Strait of Hormuz is functionally restricted. Energy prices in Europe, a continent heavily dependent on imported natural gas and oil, are exploding upward.
Inflation is tearing through their economies.
Exactly. These foreign institutions and pension funds desperately need to raise liquid cash to navigate their own domestic energy crises.
The mechanics of how they raise that cash is what creates the doom loop. They look at their balance sheets, they see massive holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds, and they initiate massive sell-offs.
They liquidate their U.S. debt to raise the cash necessary to survive their own localized economic emergencies.
But when a massive chunk of the developed world starts aggressively dumping U.S. bonds onto the open market simultaneously, the underlying price of those bonds crashes.
Because bond prices and bond yields move in opposite directions.
Right. As the price crashes, the interest rate the U.S. government is forced to pay on new debt goes even higher. It creates a vicious, self-sustaining feedback loop. The more intense the energy pain in Europe becomes, the more aggressively they sell U.S. bonds, which directly makes it vastly more expensive for the U.S. government to fund its own operations.
It's the definition of a perfect macroeconomic storm.
Mm.
And yet, amid all of this profound fundamental deterioration in the bond market and global supply chains, we have this bizarre, almost surreal disconnect happening simultaneously in the stock market.
The stock market versus reality. The analysis refers to it as the AI disconnect. The deep dive highlights a specific, historically reliable chart that tracks U.S. job openings plotted against the performance of the S&P 500, going back roughly 25 years.
Historically, these two lines track each other in almost absolute perfect lockstep.
The underlying economic logic makes intuitive sense. A robust economy creates more job openings, which means more consumers have disposable income, which drives higher corporate revenues, which ultimately justifies a higher stock market valuation.
But right now, in the environment of 2026, the historical correlation has completely shattered. The lines have violently diverged.
Job openings are crashing, again, referencing Jerome Powell's zero net job creation reality, but the S&P 500 has remained artificially, stubbornly high.
To a traditional economist, it defies financial gravity. But there is a very specific, powerful narrative driving that stock market resilience.
The AI narrative.
Exactly. The equities market is making a massive collective bet that artificial intelligence is going to be the ultimate savior of corporate profit margins. Wall Street is betting that the rapid deployment of AI will allow major corporations to permanently eliminate massive swaths of their white-collar workforce, drastically slashing their highest expense human labor costs, while simultaneously maintaining or even increasing their overall productivity and profit margins.
It is an incredibly dystopian economic bet. The stock market is essentially pricing in a future where massive corporations become exponentially richer and more efficient, precisely because everyday people are losing their livelihoods and their purchasing power.
However, the bond market, which is traditionally much more sober and focused on risk, is aggressively calling a bluff on that AI narrative. The siren warning us that the stock market is disconnected from reality is found by looking at credit spreads.
Let's explain what credit spreads are.
Sure, a credit spread is simply the difference in the interest rate between a theoretically risk-free borrower, like the U.S. government, and a riskier corporate borrower.
So during periods of robust economic health, that gap or spread is very small. Investors trust that corporations have strong cash flows and will easily pay back their debts.
But right now, the data shows that credit spreads are blowing out. This means bond investors are suddenly demanding vastly higher interest rates to lend money to corporations because they believe the underlying risk of widespread corporate defaults is rising rapidly.
I want to tie this back to the listener's blast radius again. When corporate credit spreads blow out, it means it just became significantly more expensive for your employer to borrow the money they use to fund daily operations, expand into new markets, or make payroll.
And when their borrowing costs spike, their immediate reaction is to freeze hiring, halt promotions, and initiate layoffs.
And the historical track record of this indicator is terrifying. The analysis notes that over the last 20 years, every single time corporate credit spreads have blown out rapidly while the S&P 500 was sitting near all-time highs, a brutal, protracted bear market in stocks followed shortly after.
The indicator is 3 for 3 in the last 2 decades.
The bond market is screaming through its pricing that a massive economic contraction is imminent, but the stock market has its hands over its ears, blindly humming the AI utopian song.
Which brings us to the ultimate systemic dilemma. The bond market is fracturing under the weight of sovereign debt. Consumer inflation is threatening to roar back due to the global energy shock. The domestic job market is fundamentally stagnant, and the geopolitical chess match in the Middle East has reached a highly volatile stalemate.
The Federal Reserve, the institution tasked with managing this entire balancing act, is officially checkmated.
They are completely mathematically trapped. Look at the Federal Reserve's dual mandate. They are legally required to keep unemployment low and to keep inflation low and stable.
Normally, in a traditional business cycle, if a recession hits and unemployment begins to spike, the Fed has a simple playbook. They lower interest rates. Cheaper money floods into the financial system, businesses borrow and hire, consumers spend, and the economy eventually recovers.
But they are paralyzed right now.
Why?
If they lower interest rates in this current environment, they risk unleashing massive, uncontainable inflation, especially with global oil supply chains already compromised by the situation in the Strait of Hormuz.
But if they keep rates high or raise them further to fight that supply chain inflation, they will absolutely collapse the already stressed out Treasury bond market, bankrupt the shadow banking system we discussed earlier, and trigger a massive deflationary recession.
There are no painless levers left to pull.
So how does this complex web of crises actually resolve? The deep dive outlines three distinct macroeconomic outcomes, ranging from a relatively benign resolution to a catastrophic systemic reset. Let's analyze outcome one first. Negotiated peace.
This represents the absolute best-case scenario for the global economy.
In outcome one, the back-channel diplomatic efforts actually succeed. The conflict in the Middle East ends relatively quickly. Iran receives the binding security guarantees it has been demanding. The U.S. pulls back its military posture in the region.
And as a direct result of the de-escalation, the Strait of Hormuz fully reopens to commercial traffic. Millions of barrels of oil flow freely into the global market, energy prices plummet, and the severe inflationary pressure on the West cools off significantly.
This Goldilocks scenario gives the Federal Reserve the crucial breathing room it needs to safely cut interest rates, engineering that elusive soft landing, and the AI-driven stock market continues its march upward without a severe correction.
The analysis even neutrally observes the narrative building in political circles, suggesting a figure like J.D. Vance or another prominent diplomat potentially stepping in to aggressively broker this deal, playing the role of international peacemaker ahead of the 2028 election cycle.
However, even if we assume this happy ending materializes, we have to ask, does the global financial architecture revert to the way it was in 2019?
The analysis strongly argues that it does not. This raises an important question, right? Even in a peaceful resolution, the transition to a multipolar financial world is permanent.
The implicit trust in the weaponized U.S. dollar has been irrevocably fractured.
Saudi Arabia is not going to suddenly dismantle its offshore accounts and stop buying physical gold through Switzerland. Russia is not going to abandon its new financial infrastructure and stop selling its energy in Chinese yuan.
The alternative plumbing has been built and tested. The U.S. dollar survives in this scenario, but its era of absolute, unquestioned hegemony is permanently weakened.
Think of it like a long-term business partnership where one partner catches the other stealing from the register. They might agree to keep the business open because it's profitable, but the fundamental trust is gone. The dynamic is permanently altered.
That's a great way to put it. Now let's look at outcome two, the 3 to 4 week drag. This scenario is essentially a rapid, violent repeat of the 2008 global financial crisis.
The timeline is critical here. If the Strait of Hormuz remains restricted or closed for just a few additional weeks, the fragile global economy hits a hard breaking point.
We discussed the European contagion mechanism earlier. In outcome two, the foreign selling of U.S. Treasury bonds by energy-starved European nations accelerates uncontrollably.
This panic selling forces U.S. bond yields so high that the sheer cost of capital suffocates the domestic economy. At that point, the stock market's AI fantasy violently reconnects with the grim reality of a failing zero-growth job market.
Corporate credit spreads explode, businesses realize they cannot roll over their debts, corporate earnings collapse, and a massive systemic credit freeze ensues.
It is a classic deflationary domino effect. The shadow banking system freezes, preventing businesses from accessing cash. Massive, over-leveraged corporations begin defaulting on their private credit loans.
Layoffs spike dramatically as companies slash payroll to survive. And asset prices across the board, from commercial real estate to tech stocks, plummet as everyone rushes to liquidate assets to raise cash.
In this specific scenario, there are very few places for an investor to hide. Stocks bleed, real estate bleeds.
The analysis suggests the only temporary safe havens during this initial deflationary shock might be short-term cash equivalents or mid-term holdings of physical gold. It is a brutal bust driven entirely by the sudden, unbearable cost of capital.
But then we have outcome three, and this is the scenario that keeps macroeconomists and central bankers awake at night. This is the implementation of yield curve control, or what the deep dive ominously refers to as the big print.
So, what does this all mean? Let's clearly define this for the listener. Outcome three is the nightmare scenario where the geopolitical conflict drags on indefinitely, energy prices remain astronomically high due to the constrained strait, and the U.S. government literally reaches the mathematical point where it can no longer afford to pay the interest rates demanded by the open bond market.
The bond market effectively goes on a buyer's strike. At this critical juncture, the Federal Reserve is forced into an impossible binary choice.
What are their options?
They can either step back and allow the U.S. Treasury bond market to collapse, which would instantaneously take the entire Western financial system down with it, or they can step in and save the system by printing trillions of dollars out of thin air to aggressively buy the bonds themselves.
And the mechanical process of the Fed buying those bonds is yield curve control. By creating massive artificial demand for treasuries, they drive the price of the bonds up, which mathematically forces the interest rate back down to a manageable level.
They effectively cap borrowing costs by becoming the buyer of absolute last resort.
But we must emphasize a crucial, historically unprecedented difference between executing this maneuver now versus doing it in the recent past.
Right. Historically, think back to the response to the 2008 financial crisis or the massive stimulus during the 2020 pandemic. When the Fed printed trillions of dollars, the underlying baseline cost of energy, specifically oil, was incredibly cheap.
Because energy inputs were cheap, the newly printed money did not immediately cause hyperinflation in the real economy. Instead, that liquidity flowed directly into financial assets, inflating the prices of stocks and real estate.
But executing the big print, in a world where global oil is scarce and structurally incredibly expensive, that is a totally different economic beast.
If the Federal Reserve is forced to print trillions of dollars into an environment where global supply chains are actively broken and energy costs are skyrocketing, that newly created money has nowhere to go but to chase an ever-shrinking pool of scarce physical goods.
It hyperinflates the cost of living. The price of groceries, the price of rent, the price of gasoline, it all skyrockets simultaneously.
The technical term for this outcome is a hyperinflationary sovereign debt crisis, combined with severe stagflation.
You experience runaway consumer inflation, rapidly destroying the purchasing power and savings of everyday citizens, combined with a stagnant, contracting economy that is failing to produce new jobs.
It is the absolute worst of both macroeconomic worlds, and it severely, permanently damages the standard of living for the middle and lower economic classes.
Bringing this massive theoretical discussion directly back to you, the listener. How are you supposed to logically navigate a financial world facing these three wildly divergent, potentially catastrophic outcomes?
The analysts who authored the deep dive shared their own personal portfolio strategy, and it is heavily weighted toward extreme defense. They discussed rotating roughly 40% of their entire net worth out of the stock market and entirely into highly liquid cash and short-term U.S. Treasury bonds.
On a practical level, they're actively securing physical supplies at home, basically preparing their household for extended supply chain disruptions.
And crucially, from a financial perspective, they have aggressively cleared all their debt-carrying zero credit card balances, no auto loans, paying off mortgages, and even selling off leveraged real estate properties.
It is a personal financial strategy designed for maximum optionality and minimal fragility. If the system experiences the severe liquidity shock of outcome 2, having a massive cash reserve means you survive without being forced to sell your assets at a steep loss.
And if the system experiences the runaway inflation of outcome 3, having absolutely no variable interest debt protects you from being crushed by skyrocketing interest rates.
Furthermore, the broader analysis points toward preparing your mindset for a massive, multi-year rotation of global capital. For the entirety of the last decade, investment capital has flowed almost exclusively into technology stocks, driven by the promise of future growth.
But in a new world defined by scarce energy, active geopolitical conflict, and rapid currency debasement, we are likely entering a 5 to 10-year supercycle where global capital aggressively rotates out of paper stocks and into hard, tangible commodities. Physical gold, silver, and potentially decentralized digital assets like Bitcoin.
It represents a fundamental psychological shift in how the market values assets. It is a shift from valuing promises, like the future earnings multiples of a software company, to valuing things, the actual physical commodities that sovereign nations require just to keep their economies functioning.
To synthesize all of these complex threads, the tectonic plates of the global financial system have already irreversibly shifted. The era of Pax Americana, characterized by the unquestioned unipolar economic dominance of the post-WWII era, is actively transitioning into a highly volatile, multipolar reality.
The petrodollar toll booth that the United States has relied upon to fund its deficits for decades is successfully being bypassed right now by a coordinated alliance utilizing physical gold as the settlement layer.
Whether this immediate crisis resolves in a sudden negotiated peace, or whether it spirals into a deeply painful global sovereign debt crisis, the long-term trajectory has been permanently altered. The world is aggressively repricing the concept of risk, and more importantly, it is fundamentally repricing the intrinsic value of tangible energy and physical gold relative to fiat paper currency.
which leaves us with a final, truly mind-bending contradiction to chew on as we wrap up. We started this deep dive exploring the mechanics of an invisible war. And as we look objectively at the reality of 2026, we are watching an unprecedented historical collision of economic forces.
On one side, we have the greatest deflationary force ever created by human ingenuity, artificial intelligence. It is rapidly accelerating toward the capability of zero-cost labor, a force which, in a vacuum, should make goods and services incredibly abundant and cheap.
But on the exact opposite side, colliding head-on with that technology, we have the greatest inflationary force imaginable. A total, systemic global energy shock, a fractured geopolitical landscape intentionally disrupting trade, and the looming mathematical threat of massive sovereign money printing.
It is the ultimate economic paradox of our time. So here is the provocative thought I want to leave you to ponder. What does the global economy look like if artificial intelligence successfully creates infinite corporate wealth and unprecedented hyper-efficiency, but a hyperinflated restricted commodity market makes it mathematically impossible for everyday people to afford the physical energy required to actually power that AI revolution?
Who ultimately wins in a society where the underlying software code is virtually free, but the physical electricity required to run it becomes a priceless luxury?
That tension between digital abundance and physical scarcity is the defining question that will shape the next decade of human history. It is the defining war you cannot see, but it is the one that will determine the value of everything you own. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly intense, vital deep dive. Take this information, objectively examine your own strategies, and stay vigilant. We will see you back here for the next exploration.